Hey, how are you? 30 shy 1%.
This week, we return to the story of Larry in Unbroken, Part 2, and we begin with a famous quote from the author Walt Whitman from his 1855 Leaves of Grass. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. Section 1. The Improbably Blessed Life of Larry. An odds maker might say he had no business succeeding at anything. Because you see, from 4 years old till 17 years old, Larry was the target of a sociopathic monster's rage. He and his brother, along with 2 stepbrothers and his mom, lived under an almost constant threat of violence. Here's how Larry put it. There was always a sense of impending doom. Rivertown to rivertown, ramshackle house to ramshackle house, unpaid bills kept the family on the move. Larry couldn't even count the number of elementary and middle schools. He guessed somewhere between 10 to 13. Against all odds, Larry graduated high school, but he never completed a grade in the same high school. This nomadic life kept Larry and his brothers invisible to the curious eyes of teachers and staff who might have asked questions about a suspicious bruise or an improbable cut or even a vacant stare. Even just a little stability may have allowed the compassionate eyes of a teacher or coach to notice Larry's older brother's athletic talent. That noticing could have led to better opportunities than the drug dealers who took his money and then eventually took his life. You know how money in the bank gains interest and we say that it appreciates into more money? So here's a question. How is it that Larry, with so few investments in his psychosocial childhood bank account, could appreciate into a man who would successfully raise 2 boys and 2 stepchildren and do it with affection and fidelity? How does a man from such a hard-scrabble background put together an exceptional marriage and a 35-year exceptional career as an electrician and then retire to enjoy 10 loving grandchildren and winters in Florida? So last week's article introduced Sunday Morning Cafe readers to a band of brothers who knew how to salvage toys out of junkyards and wreck Christmases. It highlighted the power of childhood imagination and play to overcome cruelty and chaos. It also put into focus the power of a shared burden to lighten a load. Once again, Sunday Morning Cafe returns to the theme of psychological and spiritual resilience as exemplified in this week's subject, Larry. So let's return to the question, how did Larry stay unbroken? Next section, how to read this article. I remember reading that there was a quality to Renaissance art that celebrated the glory of the human body as well as human achievements. This was seen as radical at the time. Renaissance artists, despite the objections of religious authorities, had the audacity to celebrate the divinity that was contained within the human condition. Though not a poet from that era, Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, quoted at the top of the article, nicely captured that perspective when he audaciously said, I celebrate myself, and then seemed to invite his reader to celebrate themselves as well. As I sifted through hours of interviews with Larry, studying his resilience, what came through had less to do with skills and practices and more to do with something profound that's just part and parcel of our human condition. As we pick Larry's story back up again, I'd like to invite you to take up the lens that Walt Whitman looked through when he looked out at the world and then how he'd take that same lens and look back inside of himself. I want you to follow his lead, just the way he did it. For as long as it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee, I invite you to not only celebrate what's in Larry, but to notice the common humanity that you share with him, and in that way, celebrate what's in you as well. See if you can't recognize in Larry and in yourself a kind of flesh and blood nobility that artists like Michelangelo tried to capture in stone and paint. So, let's get back into Larry's story. Overcoming a Cruel Past, all about how Larry's Aunt Rebecca became his home base. It's hard to imagine a worse divorce settlement than the one that ended the marriage of Larry's mom and dad. It was only a measly once a month that Larry and his brother Greg were allowed a furlough from hell to their biological dad's house. Once a month, the timer on their freedom would start promptly at 10 a.m. on a Saturday and then end at exactly 5 p.m. on the following Sunday. And get this, if their dad happened to be late, Dick, their live-in sociopathic stepfather, would arbitrarily and sadistically cancel that month's visit. When these little oases did happen on schedule and the boys returned on a Sunday evening, that's when the interrogations would begin. What did you tell them? Where did you go? What did you do? A wrong answer would get you a beating, or worse, potential cancellation of these visits to Dad's house. Larry and his brother Greg knew all too well that Dick was mean enough to follow through on such threats. And that's why, true to the script that abused kids follow, Larry and his brother kept their suffering to themselves. So, what happened on these little 31-hour visits, you might wonder? Well, Greg and Larry got to experience a real home where belts, extension cords, and class rings were never used to deliver bruises or cuts or humiliations. For Larry, the best thing about these monthly visits was getting to spend time with his Aunt Rebecca. Oh, he felt loved by his dad as well as his grandma, but it was his Aunt Rebecca that gave him really everything that mattered. It was her love that gave him a secure inner home base. Our interview took place over the phone when we talked about this, but you could hear the smile and feel the warmth in Larry's voice when he said, "Aunt Rebecca loved me to death. She loved me no matter what," he continued. "She was always a calming presence." It's Aunt Rebecca who gets the credit for Larry not becoming a drug addict like his older brother Greg. "Anytime I'd think of her," he said, "I didn't want to be a disappointment to her. So he'd think of her when he needed to complete homework assignments. He'd think of her when he had to study for tests. It was the thinking of her that led to his 1 year at a time successful finishing of each consecutive school year, despite the fact that his full-time family was one step ahead of the debt collectors and not very far at all from chaos at any given moment. In my profession, it's object relation psychology that describes the process where kids are said to introject their caregivers. More or less, that word means that they kind of psychologically swallow their caregivers inside. In other words, they internalize them and make them a part of themselves. When successful attachment occurs, thanks to a person like Aunt Rebecca, such a child is able to take the raw material of unconditional love and weave it into what's called a secure psychological base. And that's the foundation to build a life and an identity in the world. It was from this secure base, built from Aunt Rebecca's unconditional love, that allowed Larry to disprove Dick's premonition. "You'll never graduate high school." "The hell I won't," Larry whispered to himself on the day he took his last beating and ran away from home. From there, he finished his senior year, and after that, he met his destiny. Larry's story tracks pretty closely, in fact, you might say precisely, with the findings of resilience research. I'm thinking, for instance, of Gina O'Connell Higgins's research that she published in her 1994 book, Resilient Adults, overcoming a cruel past. In it, she described what she discovered after interviewing over 100 adult subjects in depth. What they have in common? They all had childhoods loaded up with the most severe abuse you can imagine. But that's not the only thing they had in common. Like Larry, these adults had achieved success both in their careers as well as their personal lives once they grew up. Want to know the main finding of all this research? In each of these subject stories, there was someone who showed these severely abused children no matter what kind of love. Someone like Aunt Rebecca. Again, like Larry, it was often a love that was experienced no more than once a month or even less. Sometimes it was just getting to observe a neighbor's family, which gave them an aspirational goal for the future they would one day create. You kind of got a sense, or you get a sense from these kids who grow up this way, that they possess this ability to take that little bit of love that they receive and to multiply like the loaves and fishes. It's as if the human soul has a CRISPR function built into it that can take a sample of Aunt Rebecca's unconditional love and sort of replicate its RNA until there's enough love to construct a scaffold that can hold a life. But let me notice another takeaway from Larry's story. For the last dozen or so years, I've been surprised by the great variety of people who in my earlier career would never even think to pay a psychotherapist a visit. It seems to me that there's a growing awareness of how frequently trauma shows up in people's lives, and there's even more awareness about the impact that trauma can have on people, limiting their ability to have the kind of life they want to have. Maybe you've had to recognize the impact of trauma in your life. Maybe it took that kind of dramatic form and shape of Larry's childhood trauma of abuse. Or maybe your disruption was more subtle, but nonetheless real. I one time listened in disbelief, this is 4 years ago, as a 90-something-year-old farmer told me that, in his estimation, the pandemic of 2020 was harder on people than the Great Depression or even World War II. Unlike those epic events, what he said was, those earlier events in the 1930s and 40s exercised a kind of centripetal force that pulled communities together, where they bonded against a kind of common crisis. He thought of COVID as exercising more of a centrifugal force that flung people apart and led to isolation. If people in my profession are in the business of helping people to acknowledge their psychological wounds, it seems to me that it's essential to equally acknowledge that what was true of Larry and the study I just mentioned is true of you and me as well. Dorothy Day, that 20th century saint and co-founder of the Catholic worker movement, used to bristle when she was referred to as a saint. I don't want to be dismissed that easily, she'd protest. Miss Day knew the human tendency to construct Mount Olympuses where we cordon off those whose lives might challenge us. We make them safe and tame their challenging messages and examples down by creating a little gated community for them in our imagination and label them as saints. Once we regard their holiness as unattainable, after all, they are saints, we can admire them from a safe distance. All the while, an unrecognized greatness pulses at the core of ourselves that has called us and will call us to quiet and not so quiet acts of beauty and bravery. Profession fails to simultaneously highlight the unbroken part. After all, at the top of this article, we heard Walt Whitman remind us, what is in Larry is in you and me as well. We celebrate Larry's resilience in the face of impossible odds because his story points beyond himself to a strength that resides within you and me, as well as the generations after you and me. Oh, and one more thing. Did you pick up how Larry's story challenges you and me to look out beyond the boundaries of our own fenced-in yards? Maybe you're called to be someone's Aunt Rebecca, to show up with a small or a large piece of a no matter what kind of love, that will one day fit together with other pieces to form a secure base for a young man or a young woman's life. Do you have a loaf of a no matter what kind of love to spare, not only for your own children, but for your nieces, nephews, or adopted nieces and nephews, for kids who visit your house, for kids you coach and teach in big and small ways? Can you spare a little meditation time this week to step back into those moments in your life when an Aunt Rebecca invested a no matter what kind of love in you? And now I'm going to switch to some reflection questions that you'll find on this week's printed blog if you prefer to take your questions that way. But for those of you who stay on this podcast, I'll go through those questions now. All right, so the first one, just this. What stood out for you in this article, and why do you suppose it stood out for you? Second question. In my experience as a clinician, I find that clients are reluctant to use the word trauma to describe their experience. So, without employing that word, can you think of any difficult experience or a series of experiences that you've that have left a psychological or spiritual scar within you? What effect does this scar cause in the current time zone for you? What helps with those side effects from that scar? And what have you found that's not particularly helpful at all? Third question. That felt like way more than one question there, but the third set of questions, how about? Can you get in touch with the story of when someone's no matter what kind of love made all the difference for you? And then the final the second to last question. Can you think of a time when your no matter what kind of love assisted someone else through a hard time? Finally, what are the creative ways that you connect with the divinity within, however you've come to understand that? Thanks for listening, and I'll speak with you again next week on Sunday Morning Cafe.